I spoke briefly about the Internet of Things, or IoT as we often refer to it, in the earlier module on software maintenance. And this was the principle of let's connect these everyday things we have to the Internet, and that will give us new features or new ways of using the thing that forms part of IoT. But this is also causing us some pretty serious problems. Let me give you an example of just how bad it can get. This is a child in his bedroom being monitored via an IoT webcam. And in this particular incident, a stranger managed to hack into the webcam, which was being used as a baby monitor, and talk to the child at night. Now this is a terrifying concept. And imagine the reaction of the parents where they have a young child saying, "I keep hearing a strange person talk to me at night." And the parents would have inevitably been dismissive, a child's imagination. And it seems inconceivable that someone would actually have compromised a webcam in a child's bedroom and tormented them late at night. But this is what happened in this case, and it's certainly not an isolated case either. And the problem is that there are many webcams out there that are ripe for this sort of attack. But how does it actually happen? How does an attacker manage to get hold of a webcam and start talking to a kid in his bedroom? Let's take a look. There are 3 key steps I want to talk about here. And unfortunately, they are pretty trivial, which explains why it does happen with alarming regularity. Now, the first one is discoverability. And this speaks to the fact that it's easy to scan the entire internet for IoT things. Individuals can do it from their own machine, and there are services out there that will do it for them. So, for example, there are services that list all sorts of different IoT connected devices. It's simply an index of what's on the internet. That index includes publicly facing webcams. There are other services out there that are somewhat more nefarious, and their sole purpose is to go and index webcams and make them accessible to other people. So that's the first bit. It's not hard to find them. The second point here is that many webcams are overexposed. So there are certainly cases where people buy a webcam with the intention of making it publicly accessible, but in many cases people are caught out unawares. They buy a webcam, they put it in their home for purposes such as monitoring the kids, and then without realizing it, they've made it publicly facing. So of course, once they do that, we come back to that discoverability point where it's now easy to find. The third problem that makes things even worse is the passwords that are used on these devices. Now those passwords can be weak. We spoke about that earlier on in the course. It's going to be something poor like the dog's name. In many cases, it's the default password that the manufacturer put on the device. And one of the problems we've got with internet-connected devices is the same default password being used on every single one of them. That's an alarmingly common occurrence. And once an attacker knows what the default password is for a particular device, if they come across that device somewhere, then that's the first password they're going to test. Even worse though, is that in many cases the password is missing altogether. It's extremely easy to find publicly facing webcams that just simply have no requirement for the user to enter a username and a password at all. And this is what makes it so easy for attackers to get access to webcams. It's not just webcams though. There is a lot of stuff we're connecting to the internet that's starting to make a lot of trouble for us. Let me give you some examples. I've picked just a very small handful of IoT devices that we've already seen serious security incidents with. So for example, the Lifx light bulbs. I mentioned those a little bit earlier on in the course. Now, the problem with Lifx, as I mentioned, was that it was actually leaking the Wi-Fi passwords of the network. And this is an important thing to remember with IoT. Many people think that a security incident with something like a light bulb would be a problem that really didn't go any further. It's just the light bulb. So maybe an attacker could turn the lights on and off rapidly, change the color, do something else that doesn't exceed the boundaries of that IoT device itself. But when it's leaking the Wi-Fi credentials, then the scope of risk suddenly grows quite dramatically. It's not just Lifx though, we've seen the same problem with the iKettle. This is a connected kettle, and the connected kettle was doing the same thing. It was leaking the credentials of the Wi-Fi network it had been connected to. So again, as with the light bulb, it's not just a risk to your coffee and tea making ability, it's a risk to your entire network. The same thing happened again with the Ring doorbell. So this is a doorbell with a built-in webcam so that you can remotely see who's at your door. It's a great concept. Connectivity is genuinely a feature that makes the doorbell better. But in this case, it also gave up the credentials to the network which it was connected to. Moving on to something a little bit different is webcams and digital video recorders created by Xingmai. Now the interesting thing here is that Xingmai actually creates the chips that go into other people's webcams and DVRs. But the significance here is that in late 2016, these devices were found to have been compromised by attackers and were being used in the hundreds of thousands to launch attacks on other websites. So this was literally attackers using cameras and video recorders in people's homes to try and take down large websites. And it was enormously effective as well. Now this was a problem with default credentials on the device. And unfortunately, it was hard-coded into the devices as well. So these actually needed to be recalled. And one final one is the Nissan Leaf. Now this is actually a vulnerability which I reported. And it was one that was discovered whilst I was running a workshop. And someone in my class actually found that they could use the mobile app that comes with their car to control the climate control features of other cars. Not only that, but they could pull back the battery status of other cars, the trip history of other cars. And that then started to cause privacy problems, as well as the fact that you really don't want someone actually controlling physical functions in your vehicle. All of these things could be made both better and worse due to connectivity. Now that then raises the following question for consumers. Now this is really quite a difficult question, and think about it in the context of a vehicle like the Nissan Leaf. When someone goes in to buy that vehicle and they want to use that internet connected feature, how do they know if it's secure? Of course, everyone has the same reasonable expectation that when they buy an item like a car, it will actually be secure. No one expects to have security vulnerabilities, but obviously many times they do. The real problem with all this is that there simply is no way to know for sure. If you're looking at buying a connected car or kettle or any number of other things that can now talk over the internet, it is impossible to tell in advance if it's going to have serious security problems or not. However, there are a number of things you can do to reduce the risk when you do connect an IoT thing to the internet. Let's take a look at those now. The first one is simply this: consider what you connect. There are many devices that you buy today which come with internet connectivity, but you may not actually require it. A perfect example is the amplifier in my home cinema has internet connectivity. I don't know why. I don't know what it does when it's connected to the internet. And as best I can tell, it doesn't really offer me any functional upside by plugging it in. So it's simply not connected. I cannot have my home amplifier compromised via the internet if it's not connected to the internet in the first place. So begin there. Think about, do you really need to plug the thing in? The next thing is to consider the exposure of the IoT thing. The webcams were a perfect example. In that story where the man was talking to the child in his bedroom, did that webcam really need to be exposed over the internet? Earlier on, I mentioned that I have a Wi-Fi power switch for my coffee machine. I could expose that over the internet so that if, hypothetically, I wanted to turn the coffee machine on whilst I was out, I could do it. But that really isn't something I need to do. And by consciously not exposing that IoT thing publicly, that's going to reduce the risk footprint that it has. I'm not going to have someone outside of my home ever able to access that switch. And finally, thinking about how much you share. So being conscious that an IoT thing is usually collecting data and is very often sending it back to the internet. I'll give you one more personal example here. I have some IoT security cameras in my home. They use the service provided by the manufacturer to store video in the cloud that I can review remotely. Now, for a security camera, that actually makes a lot of sense because you want to be able to see what's going on in your home whilst you're away. But when I installed them at home, I made a really conscious decision about what information the devices were going to collect. And that was as simple as deciding which direction to point them in. I don't point them in directions where my kids spend most of their time. I don't point them in any private areas of the house which I wouldn't want exposed publicly. I have them pointed outdoors, at yards, at places which, for all intents and purposes, are publicly accessible. And I do that simply because if the worst does happen, and someone actually gains access to that footage, the damage to me is minimized. So these 3 pieces of advice here are things that are very pragmatic and very simple to implement. It just requires a bit of common sense and a bit of forward thinking in terms of how to minimize your risk of running IoT devices. I want to look at one more thing that gives you a bit of insight into where we're heading in the world of IoT. This is a Lifx smart toilet. It is a connected toilet. Now, I've said a couple of times in this course that IoT is about connecting everyday items in the hope of somehow making them better. In this case, the toilet comes with a companion app. So you can run up the My Status application and control various features of the toilet. Now, I don't want to go into too much graphic detail, but this is more than just your average toilet. It is a rather full-featured device. However, as with so many of the IoT things that we've seen in this course, the Status did end up having a security vulnerability. And it was this. When you think about the sorts of things that can go wrong in your life due to security problems, this probably wasn't one of the first things that came to mind. But it is a good illustration of where we're heading in terms of just how much risk we're introducing into our everyday lives. And it is hard to imagine a more distressing security vulnerability than this one. On that note, let's move on and summarize the course.